Well, hello, friends. Thanks so much for tuning in. We do appreciate your support. Thanks for checking us out at SGT Report and the Liberty Mill. We have on the line our good friend Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Group. Harley, how are you?
I'm fine, Sean. Good to talk with you.
Thanks so much for taking the time, Harley. I just want to wish everybody a happy Easter, and I want to welcome Harley back. Harley, this just seems like a great opportunity to discuss what's going on in the Ukraine. We're seeing reports here from Zero Hedge that the U.S. is going to deploy troops to Poland. The one-upmanship against Putin continues, and it just seems to me that John Kerry and Barack Obama are absolutely as clueless as can be and have really become sort of the laughingstock in the international community as these two jokers try to put Putin and Russia in a box when clearly the country in a box is the United States, as Russia and China are probably better positioned to take on this monetary world war that Obama and the banks seem hell-bent on pushing us into. So Harley, I just want to get your viewpoint on Ukraine, and then we can talk about anything else you'd like.
Well, I think what you just said is extremely important because most people forget that 100 years ago when World War I started, it was preceded by a financial crisis, a very severe financial crisis globally. It wasn't the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand which led to the war. That was one of the triggers. But there had been an ongoing battle between an endangered British Empire and an emerging potential for a French-German-Russian alliance. And that was why the British pulled the trigger on World War I. And of course, they had the willing stupidity of the Habsburgs in Austria, Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany, and the clueless Tsar Nicholas, to use your term. We have a cast of characters at the top, not much better than those feeble-minded monarchs. Today, what we have is a continuing breakdown of the transatlantic financial system. And that's directly related to the reckless policies that are being pushed by Obama in the form of regime change. And I think this is really the key to understanding this. There's no inherent reason for us to be at odds with Russia. In fact, Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when he was asked about is there what military urgency about Russia moving into Crimea, he said, no, there's no strategic interest in Russia moving into Crimea that should break the U.S.-Russian discussion militarily. Because right now the U.S. is very dependent on Russia for Afghanistan. If we're going to remove troops and equipment from Afghanistan, or even to continue to provide for them, we need the corridors through Russia. There was ongoing collaboration between the U.S. and Russia on Syrian chemical weapons and also on drug fighting. And under the guise of supporting so-called freedom fighters in Ukraine, which is a hypocritical lie, but under that guise, the United States has broken those relations with Russia, including international drug trafficking collaboration. So, what we're seeing is a fraud that's being put over on the American people. And I think a lot of people aren't buying it, just as they didn't buy the Syrian situation. But the Obama administration is being helped by the Goebbels-style propaganda, nonstop attacks on Putin, on Russia, as though Putin is itching to go into Western Europe, when in fact it's the other way around. The Obama administration, as you pointed out, is itching to put troops and weapons on the border of Russia in Eastern Europe, in violation of agreements made by Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush with the Russians. So this is a reckless, dangerous policy, but it has really nothing to do with strategic fighting with Russia and everything to do with the disastrous collapse of the financial system.
We saw an interesting conversation take place between Edward Snowden and Vladimir Putin live on Russian TV the other day. Edward Snowden asked Putin if the Russian government spies on its citizens, to which Putin laughed and said, no, we don't have that in place. We don't do that to our citizens, unlike the United States government. He also said, as it relates to sanctions against Russia by the United States, he said, and I'm paraphrasing Harley, he said, the United States is willing to cut off its nose to spite its face. And it seems like the only straight shooter, if you compare Obama's rhetoric and John Kerry's processed, teleprompted rhetoric to Putin speaking off the cuff like a real leader, it seems to me that the one person who's speaking truth consistently is Putin. It's shocking to see this.
Well, of course it is. And the American people need to be shocked by hearing the truth. And unfortunately, you can't get it through the media and you can't get it through our elected leaders. You have the scene where Obama's blustering all the time, threatening Russia. And then for McCain and Lindsey Graham, that's not enough. So unless McCain really wants to fight a war with Russia, which I think he might, but that's why I say you have to look at the broader strategic issue here. What's at stake in Ukraine has to do with two things. One is the debt that's owed by Ukraine. Ukraine has between 15 and 30 billion euros of debt that has to be refinanced this year. And when the EU, the European Union, made an initial offer to Ukraine back in November of last year, the Ukrainians looked at it and they said, we're going to get very little money, and instead we're going to get the International Monetary Fund. I'm talking now about the Yanukovych government. We're going to get the IMF coming in here telling us we have to strangle ourselves. So they rejected it. And the Russians offered them 15 billion euros, cheap gas, and longer-term trade agreements. Now, this gets to the heart of the issue. What is it that Putin really wants? Does he really want to take over these broken down economies? Putin made it clear 2 years ago when the EU asked the Russians to help them out when they were on the verge of a breakdown of BNP Paribas, of Deutsche Bank, of Unicredit, and many of the major banks, Santander. The Western banks went to him and said, will you buy Eurobonds? And Putin said, why would I eat someone else's spoiled food? It will just give me indigestion. And instead, he turned toward China. He turned toward India, Brazil, South Africa, and said, let's see if we can do something outside of this collapsing system. And for a collapsing system, the last thing you want to see is an alternative, even if it's weak at first. You don't want to see a situation where people might jump out of the austerity regimes and jump out of the euro and jump out of the dollar into some different currency, which would be backed by industrial production and raw materials, when our Western system is backed by nothing. It's a paper and computer fraud. The money that you think you have in the bank, if you go online and look at your bank account and you say, oh, good, I have X number of dollars, those are just markings on a computer. They're digits. They represent nothing. Now, the fact that today you could withdraw that doesn't mean you'll be able to tomorrow, as we're heading toward bail-in regimes in the West. So Putin basically said, forget that. We're going to, if we have to batten down the hatches, we will. We have dollars. The Chinese have dollars. And they decided they were going to start an accelerated trade and infrastructure development program. And Putin held that out to Ukraine. The Ukrainians looked at Greece. They looked at Spain. They looked at countries that are under IMF austerity in order to stay with the euro. And the Yanukovych regime said, no thanks. And at that point, while there was unrest in Ukraine, because Yanukovych was not a good guy, he was corrupt, he was tied to some of the oligarchs. Yanukovych was not exactly Putin's favorite. But what Yanukovych said is, I'll go toward the Russians right now. But he never cut off the option of later on doing something with the euro. Immediately, Victoria Nuland, the former assistant to Dick Cheney, one of the neocons, her husband Robert Kagan is one of the people who got us into Iraq. These neocons that were holdovers from Cheney joined together with what I call the liberal imperialists, like Susan Rice, like Samantha Power, the ones who basically are the authors of the regime change doctrine, now called responsibility to protect. They're not as crass as Cheney was, but it's the same policy. And this is a policy designed to break the back of any alternative monetary system and to force the whole world under the bankers' dictatorship that exists today in the transatlantic union. So that's what the Russians rejected. So Nuland and others sent their teams that had been given military training into groups of people who were opposed to Yanukovych for corruption, young people who just wanted to demonstrate, wanted more freedom. And they used those people who supposedly were freedom lovers to launch an insurrection and a coup. And as soon as the coup came in, and Newland called it. You remember, Sean, we talked about this last time, the yachts question, the intercepted phone call where Newland said, who's going to be the next president?
That's right.
He was the next president. And what was the first thing he did? He brought in the International Monetary Fund. And they said, we'll refinance your debt. But in order to get our money, you're going to have to impose a strict austerity regime. And Yatsenyuk, who's now the president of Ukraine, said he took this job on as a suicide mission because he knew the people of Ukraine would hate him soon for what he was going to do. And so they imposed a 50% cut in pensions, a 40% increase in oil and gas prices. And the people in eastern Ukraine saw that Medvedev and Putin were offering the Crimeans a higher pension than they were getting and cheap oil and gas. And so they're saying, that's what we want. We don't want this IMF regime, which is largely a military coup with open Nazis like Yarosh of the right sector, providing the military might to impose the IMF dictatorship. So if people get this, if they see this, and to do that, you have to break through the controlled press because it's not going to tell you this. But this is what's going on. It was a coup. And the other part of the coup is the decision to deploy anti-ballistic missile systems, troops. General Breedlove of NATO announced that we're going to put 10,000 troops in Poland. Who's threatening Poland? Why do we even still have NATO? NATO was a product of the Cold War, which ended 20 years ago. And the irony, and I know this isn't lost on you, Sean, is that Kerry and Obama are saying this is not the 20th century. Well, who's got the 20th century policy or the 19th century or the 18th century British Empire policy?
Right.
It's the Obama administration and their defenders in both the Republican and Democratic Party.
Well, look, Harley, we know that CNN and Fox News, really, and certainly MSNBC are all arms of the controlled propagandist Mockingbird media, and they're even having a hard time spinning some of this into anything that the American public could actually digest as being anything other than propaganda. I want to ask you about these anti-Semitic flyers that the State Department, that John Kerry and Obama ran with, that were supposedly being distributed in Ukraine, saying that Jews need to register. And they ran with that, and they tried to turn that into a big deal, and even CNN admitted that clearly the flyers were fakes. And the CNN correspondent reporting on it from Ukraine said it's really quite stunning that Kerry and Obama would make such a big deal out of these flyers when clearly they're fakes. And then the other thing we know is that all wars are bankers' wars, Harley, and the CIA director, John Brennan, was in Ukraine recently. This is, for anyone with a heartbeat and a pulse, we say it time and time again, the men behind the curtain have been unveiled. The real boogeymen on planet Earth are guys like Rockefeller, Rothschild, Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Obama, Kerry, George Bush Sr. We know what's going on here, Harley. So what would you want to say about anything that I just said? What's your opinion on those anti-Semitic flyers and the fact that the administration actually tried to run with that on Friday?
Well, they were just trying to cover their ass because it's the administration that's supporting the Nazis. The Obama administration, Kerry, McCain, were photographed in Maidan Square next to the right sector militia. These are people who are tied to something called the Bandera networks in Ukraine. Bandera was the name of the Ukrainian fascists who organized battalions to join the SS, the Nazi SS in the 40s, to kill Jews, Poles, and Russians after the Nazis took over Ukraine. They still wear swastikas. They still swear allegiance to Hitler. This has been BBC exposed, that it's been all over the British press, all over the European press. In fact, 3 years ago, the European Union condemned the Svoboda party, which is the third largest party, but the most important one now in the Ukrainian parliament. They condemned them for their racist and anti-Semitic policies. Now, Svoboda and the right sector are deploying militias because the regular army of Ukraine won't shoot at the pro-Russian Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. And here's another part of the propaganda. Samantha Power in the UN, who's one of the worst liars ever. She and Susan Rice together ought to be put up on trial for organizing coups and killing people and then lying baldly about it and never being challenged by the media. Samantha Power was asked, what evidence do you have that regular Russian army soldiers or even special forces are operating in eastern Ukraine? And she said, it's obvious. We don't need evidence. Now, the fact is, Ukrainian parliamentarians who were with the new government went to eastern Ukraine to negotiate. They came back and said these are Ukrainians. They're not Russians. Putin is very clever on this. He does not want to give the West a pretext. And the problem is that if the West, and by that I mean Obama on behalf of the British financial empire, which includes Wall Street, if Obama pushes, eventually Putin will respond, as we saw them respond without killing anyone in Crimea. But it's very dangerous. Now, the other point, you mentioned Brennan. The CIA director shows up in Kiev on a Saturday, and on Sunday, the government announces they're sending troops in to suppress the rebellion.
Right.
It's pretty straightforward and obvious. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist with degrees in conspiracy to know that that's what he was doing there. Now, what's interesting is, again, how poor his intelligence is. These units went in, they were surrounded by the people, and the military raised Russian flags and disarmed themselves because they didn't want to kill Ukrainians. So we're dealing with, you might say, bungling amateurs, but they're dangerous maniacs. They're not amateurs. They're looking for the confrontation.
Yeah.
And Sean, just to segue here back to this financial question, they just did a stress test of the European banks, and they're holding off releasing this. But Zero Hedge and others have gotten advance notice that about 25 of the 130 bigger banks in Europe failed the stress test. In the U.S., Citibank failed it. Bank of America failed it. They were forced to put more money into the bank, and to do that, they were given loan credits and continued quantitative easing. But the banking system is hanging on only because of continued quantitative easing, which is going to have to stop soon. In the U.S., they're talking about stopping it because they know the appetite in the population for bailing out Wall Street has about reached an end. But what's the alternative? Are they going to write down the bad debt? Are they going to bankrupt some of these banks? Of course not. They're going to go to bail-in. And bail-in is a very short-term solution where they take depositors' money, and in return they give you worthless stock in the bank. And they use that money to try and what's called evergreen, which is to keep the bad debt still supposedly liquid. These banks are highly liquid, but they're insolvent. And we need to take them through a bankruptcy process and probably jail some of them in the process. And that's what the whole Glass-Steagall fight has been about. We've got to restore the power of the government to stop private looters who unfortunately have more power than the government right now.
Yeah. Well, I want to circle back and I want to ask you, did you say it was Samantha Powers who said we don't need evidence?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, where have we heard that before, Harley? We heard it on 9/11 regarding Osama bin Laden's connection to 9/11. There was no proof ever provided. We went into Afghanistan and Iraq, and then what did we hear about the WMDs in Iraq? Well, we don't need evidence. How about Syria? How about Libya? They never seem to provide any evidence for these endless wars of conquest, and yet they always expect the American people to back them under some guise of patriotism or spreading democracy. It's such absolute lunacy. Do you want to jump in on any of that?
Yeah. Look, we've had under Bush and Obama not only the easily demonstrated worst presidents in our nation's history.
Yeah.
In the case of Bush, I don't know if he knew he was lying. In the case of Obama, he doesn't care if he lies.
Well, then let me just add to Bush, it's the Cheney factor, the Rumsfeld factor. Probably conclusively worse than Bush was the Cheney factor. But
here's a very interesting point on the present weakness of Obama, where we're beginning to see some stirrings in the Democratic Party against it. The Republicans talk against Obama, but don't do a damn thing.
Right.
They're Wall Street. There are some Democrats who are starting to get concerned that Obama is going to blunder us into a nuclear war. And so what issue do they pick up? There are two issues now that are outstanding that get right to the point you were making. And by the way, both of them touch on John Brennan. and his relationship with Bush and Cheney and his relationship now with Obama. One is the 28 pages of the Senate Intelligence Committee report on the Saudis, which was classified by Cheney and now is still classified by Obama.
That's right. They do not want the American people to know of the Saudi Arabian connection to 9/11 and what actually occurred that day. I would add the Mossad probably to that, and those documents will never be revealed. But you're right. There's, 28 pages, 30 pages about 9/11 that Congress has seen, some members of Congress has seen. They're considered classified because they don't want the American people to know about the Saudi connection to 9/11.
And the Saudi connection is John Brennan in the United States. But importantly, on that, there are two courageous congressmen, patriotic congressmen, Stephen Lynch, a Democrat from Massachusetts, and Walter Jones, a Republican from North Carolina, who have a bill before the Congress on this. And one of the points they're making is that Obama promised the families of the victims of 9/11 that he would declassify the report. He promised them twice, and he has refused to do it. Now, the second issue is this torture report that the Senate Intelligence Committee was working on. Now, I don't want to say Dianne Feinstein is a courageous patriot because she's sat on this for 5 years. She knew for 5 years that the CIA was refusing to cooperate. They were providing documents, then redacting them. And then they started to intimidate staffers. And this is under Obama. And so Feinstein came out publicly and said, this document we have on torture must be released because it has 2 points to it. One is that the torture was barbaric. It goes against any premise of the human rights of the American government. But secondly, that there was no actionable intelligence gained from it. It didn't work. Mm-hmm. Now, this report that included the Panetta's report has been suppressed by President Obama and Holder. And so Feinstein's committee voted to release it. And Obama said, okay, we'll declassify it. I'm turning it over to John Brennan and the CIA to redact it first. Now, Brennan he's the right-hand man with Obama on drone warfare, on NSA spying, he's in on it. He's the Saudi connection. And he also was working directly with Cheney on torture. So Obama, to protect Brennan, and who knows what Brennan might have on Obama, but to protect Brennan, Obama is allowing what's a real constitutional violation on 2 grounds. The CIA is operating in the United States, and secondly, the executive is suppressing the investigative authority of the Congress. Now, these are just 2 more to a laundry list of impeachable offenses committed by Obama. But this one is rankling key Democrats and some Republicans like James Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin. So what I'm seeing now with this war danger is people are looking out of the corner of their eye and they're saying, look, if Obama's left in there, we know he has no legislative agenda except to kill people with the Obamacare, with phony immigration reform, with NSA spying, but he might get us into a war that could destroy the country. And so I think the potential now, the anger in the population, the frustration, the level of suffering is reaching a point at which some members of Congress are at least open to discussing whether Obama should go. Now, I work with Keisha Rogers here, who pulled a huge upset by getting into the runoff for the nomination for the Democratic Party for U.S. Senate in Texas. Now, the Democratic Party has denounced her because she is calling for the impeachment of Obama. An African-American Democratic woman is in a runoff on May 27th in Texas with a very wealthy dentist whose loyalty is to Obama and Bush. So any of your listeners who live in Texas, and I don't care if they call themselves Republicans or Democrats, as long as they didn't vote in the Republican primary on March 24th, they can vote for Keisha in the runoff. If Keisha wins, and right now it's heading toward a toss-up, if she wins, this will be a huge crushing defeat for Obama because he has all these operatives in Texas and lots of money going against her. But we're telling them, please tell people that Keisha's not a regular Democrat because she doesn't like Obama, because that just gets her more votes. Obama is less popular in Texas than rattlesnake venom.
Well, we wish Keisha Rogers the very best. And of course, you'll never hear her name mentioned on Fox News, who you would think would love to run with that story that an African American female despises Obama. You'd think that would be a story that would get some traction. But of course, you won't see it because the left and the right are controlled there in the Mockingbird media. I wanted to ask you about a couple of very important other things, Harley, before we lose you. One of which is drought. I know that you guys are very concerned about and have been reporting on these epic droughts, really biblical level droughts in California and Texas. And our friend Michael Snyder over at the Economic Collapse blog has been reporting on it as well, asking his readers if they're prepared for the doubling of food prices by the end of this decade. And he notes that even in Brazil, which most people probably don't realize, the drought has gotten so bad that 142 cities were rationing water earlier this year. And, as you know, Harley, Brazil is one of the leading exporters of food in the world. California is an absolute breadbasket for us. Meat prices are on the rise. Texas is in horrible shape. What would you say to listeners about the drought situation, and how do we protect ourselves from what certainly is going to be inflationary food prices over the next coming year or two?
Well, what you just reported is absolutely true. The food prices are going to go up because in California, 10% of the arable farmland is taken out of production this year, and another 20% is being starved for water. So that's almost one third of the production in California, which provides over 40% of leafy green vegetables, spinach, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, things of that sort. And then, of course, cattle. The U.S. cattle herd is at its lowest level since 1951. Now, that might appeal to Michelle Obama, who seems intent on starving Americans, but that's not a good news for most Americans. Look, there's no short-term solution. You can do things with desalination, but we would run into energy shortages then. I would say that we have to have a plan in place for a massive increase in water, and that's what's called the North American Water and Power Alliance, which can bring water from Northwest Canada and Alaska through the Rocky Mountain Trench into the lower states. It would provide an increase of 20% of the water, pure water, fresh water in the United States. This was a project developed in the 1960s by Parsons Engineering Company. It was ready to go in the mid-60s, and the biggest opponent were the environmentalists who said we shouldn't mess with Mother Nature. We shouldn't divert rivers or change river channels. It also, by the way, would produce 6 to 10 million jobs building dams, water channels, engineering projects, incredible construction, building of new cities. It's an updated TPA type program, which is much larger in scale. If we don't take something on like that, we will lose much of the food production in the United States. And as most of your listeners should know, there's no quality control for imported food. You don't know what's in it. And you've got Monsanto and others messing around with the food supply. So we're in a serious danger of that. Now, the other thing you should know about this is that the idea of conservation is not going to solve it, because you need more water. And one of the things with NWAPA is you would actually modify the climate. Now, there's one other additional point here, which is those people who have been screaming about global warming, who now are talking about climate change. They're being proven, their science is being proven to be nothing but fraud and lies. We're actually in a global cooling, and we're now at a low level of solar activity, which correlates with drought. Now, the sun is going to pick up again in a couple of years, but there's no guarantee that we're going to have a significant change in our climate in a way that's good. It may even get rougher. There are these earthquake patterns that are developing and so on. So we need more money in science. We need more NASA research looking at the Earth from satellites. And Obama is cutting all of that. Mm-hmm. Every vector of things that are necessary is being cut.
Yep.
This administration.
Yep. Well, I think that's because we are under attack by the powers that be. I mean, literally, there's a multifaceted attack against the people in this country. And really, as you know, from a banker's perspective, there's a multifaceted attack against the people of planet Earth. And all wars are bankers' wars, Harley. And, it couldn't be more true that the powers that be are turning the apparatus now around on the American people. And that could not be more evident than the BLM land grab in the Bundy Ranch standoff. Now, I wanted to get your opinion on what happened there in Nevada. The interpretation by many is that the liberty movement is rising, and finally a line has been drawn in the sand. And in this particular case, at least, the BLM backed off. Now, we know Harry Reid isn't done. He's a criminal. He's a traitor. He says this is not over. He's got his hands in all sorts of pots there in Nevada, and he ought to be impeached. He ought to be jailed. I wanted to get your take on the BLM land grab and potentially how it relates to Agenda 21. Those who aren't familiar with Agenda 21 better get up to speed real quick, because what the powers that be want to do is they want to kick people off their land and herd us into these big centralized cities. If you guys want to see what the future looks like for America if we don't stand up and take our government back, just look at Mexico City. That's where we're headed. Harley, what's your take on the BLM land grab?
Well, I think it was a sort of a test case, a probe to see what the result would be if they went ahead and started doing this. And as you say, initially they backed down, but I don't think it's going to change the policy. I think the point you were making before is the most relevant one. Our nation's under attack. Our Constitution is under attack. And it's really not the BLM that's the director of this. It's the Obama administration as a puppet of these globalized banking and insurance interests. And their intent is to reduce the population on the planet, to find out who are the people who will fight and isolate them, call them crackpots or shoot them or jail them. And then through mind-numbing so-called entertainment and lying media, herd the rest of the population into a passive herd of sheep. And the fact that people fight is very important. But I think what we've got to do is, rather than take the approach that, okay, now what we've got to do is make sure we have guns and we're ready to react every time this kind of thing happens. No, we've got to target the Congress and take over Washington. Right. And I don't mean necessarily, a real revolution, but it can be nonviolent. And that's what I'm working on with this U.S. Senate campaign here in Texas. If people can wake up and actually be shown that there are solutions to the problems that we face that are not being debated in that clown show called the Congress by the two Wall Street parties called the Republicans and the Democrats, but that we can shake people into action, because people will act now. I think that's what the Nevada case, the Bundy case, shows, that if you push hard enough, people will respond. But I want to make sure that we realize that we shouldn't fight against the tentacles, but we should go at the heart and the brain of the enemy. And that's Wall Street and the City of London. That's why I think Glass-Steagall is so important, Sean, because we've got to take away their power to operate without any impediments to what they do.
Right. Well, the battle continues, Harley. It seems every time we talk, there's just new issues for us to talk about and precious few solutions. But you're absolutely right. We have to cut off the head of the snake, and that's this tyrannical power in Washington that has seized control of our government, stolen it from the people, and turned the apparatus of peace and freedom and liberty and this huge war power that they control around on the people and around on planet Earth. They've turned it around on humanity. And, whether it's drone strikes in Yemen or, Afghanistan, whether it's building a billion-dollar embassy in Iraq, it's just lunacy. And anybody paying attention, and fortunately more and more people are, can see it. It's just lunacy. We've lost our liberty. And somehow, some way, we need to get it back. I'm not sure how to do that anymore, Harley. I mean, Ron Paul is not in the White House. We've got an usurper in the White House who doesn't give a rat's ass about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So I'm not sure how we take it back, but maybe conversations like this help move us in the right direction.
Well, I think the advantage we have is the man in the White House is not that bright. He's enamored of himself. They use his narcissism to trot him out there and make these statements where he sounds as though he's sincere, but you look at the actual words coming out of his mouth and you realize he's lying. And, he probably knows he's lying, but he doesn't care. But the real thing you just hit on is that there are solutions, and the American people are finding them. whether it's through programs such as yours, our people standing out on street corners with big pictures of Obama with a Hitler mustache. People are beginning to realize that you can say these things, at least for the time being. And by the way, when you talk about the overweening power of government, don't forget that monstrosity that's been built outside of Salt Lake City for the NSA to collect any data that they wish.
Yeah. We need to cut their water supply off so they can't cool those machines. And that's actually an active idea that is gaining momentum in Utah, is if the water supply is cut off to the NSA buildings, they can't cool those acres and acres and acres of unconstitutional wiretapping machines. And theoretically, then they'd have to shut down. I don't know. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but it's a great idea.
Sean, in that sense, I think it's important we can, since I know we've got to end the program, that one man can make a difference. One woman can make a difference. Look at Edward Snowden. For whatever his initial intent was, he started something which has really developed into a platform of opposition to the super police state. And if people instead of just sitting back saying, boy, that took guts, let's put some of those same guts in all of us. And I think if we do that, we can turn this thing around.
Yeah. No, well said. Absolutely. One man can make a difference. You got Stuart Rhodes and Oath Keepers standing up to power down there in Nevada, and Edward Snowden speaking truth to power and having to flee the country for having done so. You're absolutely right. Well, one man can make a difference, and you've made a big difference, Harley. You're one of my favorite guests because, first of all, I implicitly trust you, and I know you have such a grasp on history, and you're so darn articulate. So it's always great to get you on to help us recap all of these tumultuous situations that we face as Americans. And I want to thank you for your time, Harley, and thanks for all you do. And can you remind people about the great work being done there at LaRouche?
Yes, just go to LaRouchePAC.com, which is our website. It's got a lot of videos, a lot of news information, and it's updated daily. And Sean, I'd like to wish you and all your listeners a happy Easter. And maybe we can take some of the lessons of Easter, that it demonstrated that you can kill a man, but you can't kill the idea.
That's great. Thank you, Harley. Happy Easter to you too. And happy Easter to everyone who's taken the time to stick with us for this past 40 minutes and listen to this conversation with my friend Harley Schlanger, the national spokesperson for LaRouche and LaRouche PAC. Harley, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Sean. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Harley. We'll talk to you again soon.
Bye.
And again, we do appreciate everybody stopping by sgtreport.com. Thanks for joining us, and everyone have a great week.